Welcome back to our channel. We're thrilled to bring you the latest analysis. How will audiences react to the news that John is alive? Who is most worried right now? Jack can hardly believe it's true. Join us as we explore the complex web of secrets, lies, and the miraculous return that's about to change everything for your favorite characters. The idyllic, sun-drenched shores of Tahiti were supposed to serve as an impenetrable sanctuary for Jack and Diane Abbott, a desperate and much-needed escape from the relentless psychological warfare they had recently endured. Following the horrifying ordeal where Diane was held captive and psychologically tortured by the sociopathic doctor, Lawrence Markham, the couple had fled across the globe to find solace in the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves and the warm, tropical breeze. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the suffocating darkness of Genoa City had finally been left behind. Jack had dedicated every waking moment of this vacation to reassuring his wife, promising her that their enemies were securely locked away and that their future was a blank, beautiful canvas. They were completely isolated from the corporate espionage of Jabbo and the endless familial betrayals, basking in the illusion of absolute safety on a pristine, deserted beach. However, tranquility in the Abbott family is historically nothing more than the calm before a catastrophic storm, and this tropical paradise was about to transform into the epicenter of their greatest nightmare. The delicate illusion of their romantic getaway was violently shattered by the sudden, jarring ring of Jack's mobile phone, a device he had intended to ignore but instinctively answered out of a lingering sense of patriarchal responsibility. Expecting a mundane update from Kyle regarding the daily operations at Jabbo, or perhaps a routine check-in from a concerned sibling, Jack casually brought the device to his ear. What he heard on the other end of the line, however, defied every law of nature, logic, and reality. The voice filtering through the digital connection was not that of a frantic executive or a concerned family member. It was a voice carrying a specific cadence, a profound warmth, and an unmistakable authoritative timbre that Jack had not heard in years. It was the voice of a ghost. It was the voice of his father, the legendary patriarch of the Abbott family, John Abbott. In that agonizing fraction of a second, the blood completely drained from Jack's face, leaving him pale and physically paralyzed as his mind violently rejected the auditory information it was receiving. The human brain is simply not equipped to process the sudden resurrection of a loved one, especially one whose tragic death in a prison hospital had served as the defining trauma of Jack's adult life. Jack had spent years mourning John, standing over his grave, and desperately trying to fill the massive, impossible void left by his father's passing. He had spoken to John's spirit in moments of profound crisis, seeking guidance from a memory. But this was no memory, and this was no spiritual manifestation. This was a direct, real-time communication from a man the entire world believed to be dead. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, as a suffocating wave of shock washed over him, rendering him entirely speechless and gasping for the humid tropical air. Unable to comprehend the miraculous and terrifying reality of his father's survival, Jack's mind immediately pivoted to the darkest, most paranoid corners of his imagination. He desperately sought a logical, albeit malicious, explanation for the impossible phenomenon occurring in his ear. The most terrifyingly plausible conclusion his frantic mind could conjure was the involvement of his historical tormentor, Patty Williams. Patty's psychotic obsession with Jack had spanned decades, marked by a trail of violence, deception, and severe psychological abuse. She knew exactly how to exploit Jack's deepest vulnerabilities, and there was no vulnerability greater than his unresolved guilt and endless grief over the loss of his father. Jack began to fiercely rationalize that this phone call was a cruel, elaborate joke, a weaponized piece of psychological torture designed to break his spirit and ruin the fragile peace he had just established with Diane. The sheer terror of this rationalization lay in its implications. Jack had been confidently assuring Diane that Patty was securely locked away in a maximum security psychiatric ward, entirely neutralized and incapable of causing them any further harm. But if Patty was somehow responsible for this phone call, it meant she had either orchestrated a brilliant escape or was commanding a network of accomplices from behind bars. Jack's mind raced with horrifying scenarios involving deepfake audio technology, old, manipulated voice recordings, and highly sophisticated psychological warfare. He wondered if Patty was currently watching him, reveling in the sheer panic contorting his features as he listened to his dead father's voice. The thought that Patty had reached across the ocean to infiltrate their tropical sanctuary sent a chilling shudder down Jack's spine, making the warm Tahitian sun suddenly feel like ice against his skin. However, an even more terrifying alternative began to claw at the edges of Jack's consciousness. What if there was no malicious actor on the other end of the line? What if the voice was entirely a product of his own deteriorating mental state? Jack was forced to question his own sanity, wondering if the immense, unrelenting pressure of the past several months had finally caused his mind to fracture. He had been carrying the weight of the Abbott Empire, battling Victor Newman's endless machinations, and navigating the profound trauma of Diane's kidnapping. The human mind can only endure so much stress before it creates its own reality to cope. Jack was struck by the horrifying possibility that this phone call was a stress-induced hallucination, a desperate manifestation of his subconscious yearning for his father's guidance in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and dangerous. The fear of losing his mind was almost as paralyzing as the fear of Patty Williams. While Jack was trapped in this internal vortex of panic and paranoia, Diane was watching him with the acute, hypervigilant observation of a woman who had recently survived severe psychological trauma. She knew every subtle nuance of her husband's expressions, and the stark, sudden shift in his demeanor did not go unnoticed. She watched in growing horror as the relaxed, romantic man she had been laughing with just moments ago transformed into a statue of pure terror. She saw the color vanish from his cheeks, the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the phone, and the distant, haunted look in his eyes that suggested he was staring into the abyss. Diane's own fragile sense of security evaporated instantly, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct as she realized their hard-won peace was actively shattering right in front of her. Diane carefully approached Jack, her movements slow and deliberate, so as not to startle a man who appeared to be on the verge of a total psychological collapse. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his arm, silently pleading with him to return to reality and share the burden of whatever nightmare was unfolding on the other end of the line. But Jack remained entirely unresponsive, trapped in a state of suspended animation as the voice of John Abbott continued to echo in his ear. The unspoken fear hanging thick in the humid air between them was palpable. Diane knew that the shadow of Genoa City had somehow managed to stretch across the vast expanse of the ocean, finding them in their most vulnerable moment. She desperately tried to read his lips, to decipher the context of his silence, but Jack was incapable of articulating the sheer impossibility of what he was experiencing. The broader implications of this mysterious phone call, if it truly was John Abbott, were apocalyptic for the entire Abbott family dynamic. For years, the family had operated under the heavy shadow of John's legacy, using his memory as a moral compass and a justification for their corporate battles. Jack had assumed the mantle of the patriarch, making countless difficult and often morally ambiguous decisions to protect Jabor and his siblings. If John was alive, the entire foundation of Jack's authority and identity would be instantly invalidated. The grief, the guilt, and the years of mourning would all be rendered obsolete, replaced by a profound confusion and a terrifying restructuring of the family hierarchy. Jack could not begin to fathom how he would explain this to Ashley, Tracy, or Kyle, knowing that the revelation of John's survival would completely turn the Abbott family upside down. Furthermore, the miraculous return of John Abbott would have a cataclysmic impact on Billy Abbott, whose current trajectory was a masterclass in self-destruction. Billy was currently embroiled in a ruthless, manic crusade to seize absolute control of Chancellor Industries, a hostile takeover he had justified by weaponizing his father's name. Billy had convinced himself, and was attempting to convince everyone else, that he was the righteous heir to a secret corporate legacy left behind by John. He was alienating his family, terrifying his pregnant fiancée, Sally Spectra, and spiraling into a state of paranoid obsession, all under the delusion that he was honoring the Abbott name. Billy's entire sense of purpose was currently tethered to a narrative of historical reclamation, a narrative that would be instantly obliterated by the physical presence of the man he claimed to be fighting for. The reality of John Abbott's return would not serve as a comforting salvation for Billy. It would be a devastating psychological blow. If John was alive, he would undoubtedly step in to reclaim his own company, stripping Billy of his unearned victory and exposing his corporate war as a manipulated, ego-driven farce. Billy's desperate need for validation from his father had always been his greatest weakness. and to have that father return only to dismantle his grandest ambition would throsh Billy to the absolute brink. The profound irony of fighting so ruthlessly for a dead father's legacy, only for that father to return and deem him unworthy of the throne, would be a trauma Billy might not survive. This impending confrontation would undoubtedly change Billy, but whether it would finally force him to find peace or push him into unprecedented madness remained a terrifying unknown. As Jack stood on the pristine white sand of Tahiti, staring blankly at the disconnected phone in his trembling hand, the overwhelming weight of these impending family disasters began to crush him. The serene environment, with its gentle waves and rustling palm trees, no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a beautifully decorated cage. He was thousands of miles away from Genoa City, completely isolated and utterly powerless to control the shockwaves that were about to decimate his family. He looked at Diane, her face etched with profound worry, and realized that he had to protect her from this new, incomprehensible reality, even as his own mind struggled to accept it. The idyllic vacation was definitively over, replaced by a creeping, insidious dread that permeated the tropical air. However, as Jack desperately tried to formulate a plan to uncover the truth behind the impossible phone call, he remained tragically oblivious to the immediate, physical danger lurking just beyond the tree line. His paranoia regarding Patty Williams was entirely justified, but his assumption that she was operating from afar was a fatal miscalculation. Unbeknownst to Jack and Diane, the real threat was not just a voice on a phone or a stress-induced hallucination. Patty Williams and Matt Clark had successfully executed a violent escape from the psychiatric ward and had tracked their prey across the globe. As Jack stared out at the ocean, lost in the impossible resurrection of his father, unseen eyes were watching him from the shadows of the Tahitian paradise, coldly preparing to launch a brutal, physical ambush that would leave them bleeding on the very sand they had hoped would bring them peace.